mom, one from dad. They're both chromosome number 1s. We'll do it like this too. We'll say, we'll do little dots like we did before, saying, listing off all the different chromosomes we have through to 23. So we have 23 pairs. We'll also go ahead and put in, we talked about those gene markers. So within each chromosome, you have a set of genes, which is a section of DNA. I'm going to mark an exact spot on each one. It doesn't really matter, it's just I'm going to mark them here so that you get the idea of what a gene marker will look like. Here, here. Right? So we'll call this, we'll say this little spot right here, this is your gene. And a gene is a section of DNA. Usually thousands of bases long, as opposed to the codon where you only have 3 bases. So section DNA that codes for a protein. Now I'll do one other thing, terminology-wise. So you have different spots of these different genes. So because there's different spots, they call them different loci. LOCI. And loci refers to the location of a gene. Since both these chromosomes are the same, they call this too. These are homologous. And you guys already have this term. What does homologous mean? Yeah, it means same. So these are homologous. Move this guy a little bit. Homologous chromosomes. They're both number 1, so they're chromosomes. That are same and have same basic information. So here's the stuff that I used to get really confused with when I was in school and I didn't really understand. So how many different so you have red hair, brown hair, black hair, blonde hair basically, right? About 4 different hair types, right? So there's a gene right here that codes for hair color, right? We'll say it's this spot right here. Every spot is given a letter designation or a number designation. So like there's a breast cancer gene. There's BRCA1 and BRCA2. And basically there's a correlation between the people who have breast cancer and the presence of that one gene. So they'll sometimes give them kind of not random numbers or letters, but they'll give them some sort of letter designation. So BRCA1, BRCA, meaning breast cancer, has some sort of letter designation in it that makes sense. But because there's different types of that gene or different versions of the gene, it codes for different things. So we have the loci, means we have this location. You have 2 homologous chromosomes that code for the same thing, and these two spots both code for hair color. However, there's this thing called allele, and this is the term that I'm going to use a lot more than anything else. They'll say allelic frequency, type of alleles. It kind of means the same as genes, but it's different because an allele is the alternate expressions of a gene. So we use the example of hair color. Even though there's a gene for hair color, the different alleles that are there are there's just different versions of the gene. So it's truly not just dark and light. Now, the two words that you need for today, this is pretty easy. Whoa, that one's not good. This one. Genotype. Any guesses on what the word genotype means? Type of gene. It's really easy, yeah. Type of gene. And so we'll actually use like letter designations for that. So like today you'll be looking at, just depending on what your genotype is, you might be using big D, or big D, or little d, little d. So there's different versions of the genotype. Now, if genotype is the type of gene, then what is phenotype? If genotype is the type of gene you have, then what's phenotype? Yeah, I know, you're struggling with your like, type of pheno. Okay, that's the only one that's kind of weird. A phenotype is the physical, and this is how you can remember it. There's pH there, and then pH there. It's the physical expression of a gene. I know it's getting down here a little low, but that's as far as I'll go. So within different homologous chromosomes, you have loci, which are the locations of these different genes. You have different alleles for each gene. That will determine the genotype and then therefore the phenotype for each one. Okay. The other one that's kind of weird is like this. I have to give, since we use these homologs, we'll put either, on either one of these, we'll use a designation for, we'll say that this gene is for hair color. And we'll say that there's a dark and a light hair color. Or let's do eye color as well. It doesn't really matter. There's a dark and a light one. So I'll either do big D or little d as a gene. And since you have two types, two alleles, we'll do one allele for each. So for this one, I'll say it's big D. For this one, I'll say is little d. And we'll put it in there. So there's a couple of the terms that you have. If you were homozygous, what does homo mean?
Same.
Okay, and zygous refers to like a zygote. It refers to the genetics of something. So if you're homozygous, you can either be big D, you have two dominant alleles, or you're little d. It doesn't really matter. It's just that both of the alleles are the same. One other term that they use for homozygous, if you're homozygous, you're said to be purebred. Purebred means you have the same exact alleles. The genes are the same. So the two versions of this, though, that you can have is you can either be homozygous dominant, and when you're dominant, this is the kind of the only thing it really means. Dominant means that you can mask a recessive trait or gene, recessive gene. In fact, I'll even change that. You can mask in a recessive allele. So this would be an example of homozygous dominant. It's got both alleles are the same and they're both dominant. Now then you have the term recessive. recessives can only be expressed when we're being filmed. When both alleles are present. So the only way to get homozygous recessive or recessive trait expressed is when both alleles are recessive. Okay? So this is an example of homozygous recessive. Okay, so we got two different genotypes. What's the third genotype we can have? What letters would we have for the third genotype? Big D, little d. Okay, big D, little d. So there's also what they call heterozygous. Heterozygous is when you have one of each. So you have big D, little d, as an example. The other term for this one is what you call a hybrid, because you have a mix of alleles. And here's kind of the trick, especially when you're just learning this stuff, or you just don't know what's going on with this stuff. You can have homozygous dominant, all right? Because if you're homozygous, that just means that both alleles are the same, but you don't know if that means homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive. So you got homozygous dominant, you have homozygous recessive. What is heterozygous always going to be? It's always going to be dominant because there's at least one dominant allele. So if you go like this, you go, that's homozygous dominant, and I got 4 of those, and then there's one heterozygous dominant. Then I know you don't know what's going on. Or you're just practicing or something, okay? Because it's always, if you have, if you're heterozygous, you have at least one dominant allele, so you're always going to have that dominant allele present. So it kind of depends on the type of inheritance factor you have, but it's always going to mean that you have the dominant allele there, okay? I think that's it for those. Yeah, genotype. Go ahead and you can shut that off. And then take out the sheet.